In the dusty outskirts of Amarillo, Texas, where the wind carries secrets and the horizon stretches endlessly, Martha Whitfield stood in her weathered barn, her calloused hands gripping the reins of the most notorious animal in 3 counties. The widow's laughter echoed through the wooden beams as another would-be rider limped away, defeated by the beast that had earned its reputation as the unrideable bronco of Lone Star County. But what Martha didn't know was that her late husband's prized donkey harbored a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about her quiet life on the ranch. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Texas plains when word spread through the small town of Cedar Ridge that Martha Whitfield was offering a challenge no man could resist. Her wild donkey, a massive beast named Thunder, had thrown every cowboy, ranch hand, and rodeo champion who dared to mount him. The prize was simple yet enticing. Whoever could stay on Thunder's back for 8 seconds would win $1,000 and Martha's respect. What started as a local curiosity quickly became a regional phenomenon, drawing riders from as far as Oklahoma and New Mexico. Jake Morrison had heard the stories while nursing a whiskey in a saloon in Tulsa. The grizzled cowboy with steel-gray eyes and hands that bore the scars of a lifetime working cattle had never met a horse he couldn't break or a challenge he wouldn't accept. Something about the widow's dare called to him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the way folks talked about Thunder with a mixture of fear and reverence, or perhaps it was the description of Martha herself, a woman who had somehow managed to keep her ranch running single-handedly after her husband's mysterious death 2 years prior. The first challenger arrived on a Tuesday morning, a young hotshot from Dallas who claimed to have won every rodeo from Fort Worth to Houston. Martha watched from the corral fence as Thunder sized up his opponent, the donkey's dark eyes gleaming with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Within seconds, the cowboy was eating dirt, and Thunder stood calmly in the center of the ring as if nothing had happened. The pattern repeated itself throughout the week. Confident men arrived with swagger and left with bruised egos and aching bones. But Jake Morrison was different from the others, and Martha sensed it the moment his dusty pickup truck pulled into her driveway. He didn't boast or make demands, didn't even mention the prize money. Instead, he spent the first hour simply observing Thunder, studying the animal's movements and behavior with the patience of a man who understood that respect was earned, not demanded. Martha found herself intrigued by this quiet stranger who seemed to see something in her donkey that others had missed. As Jake prepared for his attempt, Martha noticed Thunder's unusual behavior. The donkey, typically aggressive and unpredictable with strangers, seemed almost calm in Jake's presence. The cowboy approached slowly, speaking in low tones that Martha couldn't quite make out, and to her amazement, Thunder didn't rear or strike. Instead, the animal stood perfectly still as Jake placed a gentle hand on his neck, and for a moment, Martha thought she saw recognition flash in the donkey's eyes. The ride lasted exactly 8 seconds and 1 heartbeat. Jake sat Thunder's back with the grace of a man born to the saddle, moving with the animal's bucking rhythm rather than fighting against it. When Thunder finally stopped, both man and beast were breathing hard, but there was no animosity between them. Jake slipped from the donkey's back and walked away without claiming his prize, leaving Martha with more questions than answers and a growing suspicion that this encounter was about more than money or pride. That evening, as Martha tended to Thunder in the barn, she noticed something she had never seen before. Hidden beneath the donkey's thick winter coat, partially concealed by carefully maintained hair, was a small scar in the shape of a crescent moon. Her blood ran cold as the memory came flooding back. A conversation with her late husband Samuel about a special marking he had put on his favorite horses to identify them if they were ever stolen. But Samuel had always said the technique was something only he and one other person knew how to do. A cowboy named Jake Morrison who had saved his life during a cattle drive gone wrong 20 years ago. Martha's hands trembled as she examined the mark more closely. Samuel had told her that Jake Morrison had died in a riding accident in Montana, that he had received word of his old friend's death just months before his own passing. Yet here was Thunder, bearing the distinctive crescent scar that only Samuel and Jake knew how to create. And here was a man claiming to be Jake Morrison who rode Thunder as if they were old companions. The pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know existed began forming in her mind, each revelation more disturbing than the last. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to Martha's ranch. Two men in expensive suits and city shoes picked their way carefully across her dusty yard, introducing themselves as investigators from the State Insurance Commission. They had questions about Samuel's death, they said, and about certain irregularities in the life insurance payout that had only recently come to light. Martha's heart pounded as they explained that new evidence suggested Samuel's fatal horse riding accident might not have been as straightforward as originally believed. The investigators revealed that Samuel had been in significant debt at the time of his death, gambling losses and bad investments that Martha knew nothing about. The insurance money had been the only thing that saved the ranch from foreclosure, but now there were questions about whether Samuel had staged his own death with help from someone who knew horses and riding well enough to make an accident look convincing. The description of Samuel's suspected accomplice matched Jake Morrison perfectly, down to the scar on his left hand that Martha had noticed when he rode Thunder. As the investigators left, Martha felt her world crumbling around her. The husband she had mourned for 2 years, the man she thought she had known better than anyone, had apparently been living a double life. But even more shocking was the possibility that Jake Morrison, the cowboy who had hidden in plain sight while she grieved, might have helped Samuel fake his death and disappear with the insurance money. The thought that Samuel might still be alive somewhere, leaving her to struggle alone while he started a new life, filled her with a rage she had never experienced. Martha confronted Jake that afternoon, finding him in the local diner where he had been staying since arriving in town. She slammed the photograph of the crescent scar down on the table between them and watched as his face went pale. The conversation that followed unraveled years of carefully constructed lies and revealed a truth more complex than Martha had imagined. Jake admitted to helping Samuel stage his death, but not for the reasons the investigators suspected. The real story began 2 years earlier when Samuel had discovered that his gambling debts were owed to some very dangerous people who had no qualms about hurting innocent family members to collect what they were owed. Faced with threats against Martha's life and the certain loss of the ranch that had been in her family for generations, Samuel had come up with a desperate plan. Jake Morrison, who had indeed been presumed dead after a riding accident, had actually survived but chose to let the world think he had perished, living under an assumed name to escape his own troubled past. When Samuel reached out to his old friend for help, Jake saw an opportunity for both of them to disappear from their problems. They had staged Samuel's riding accident carefully, using Jake's knowledge of horses and his own death as a cover story. The plan was for Samuel to take the insurance money and disappear, while Jake would watch over Martha from a distance to ensure she was safe from Samuel's creditors. What neither man had anticipated was how the guilt and loneliness of their deception would eat away at them. Jake revealed that Samuel had never spent a penny of the insurance money, instead hiding it away from Martha while he lived as a ranch hand on remote spreads across Montana and Wyoming. The weight of leaving his wife had broken Samuel's spirit, and Jake had watched his friend deteriorate over the past 2 years, consumed by regret and the impossibility of returning to the life he had abandoned. The decision to return to Cedar Ridge had been Samuel's, a last-ditch attempt to find a way to make things right. Martha's anger gave way to heartbreak as Jake explained that Samuel was dying. The stress and guilt of the past 2 years had taken a terrible toll on his health, and the doctors in Montana had given him only months to live. Samuel's greatest fear was dying without Martha's forgiveness, without being able to explain why he had put her through the hell of believing he was dead. Thunder had been their signal, the one thing that could bring Jake back to Martha's ranch without raising suspicion, a living message that only she would understand once she discovered the crescent scar. The revelation that her husband was alive but dying created a storm of emotions Martha struggled to process. Part of her wanted to rage at the deception, at the 2 years of grief and loneliness she had endured unnecessarily. But another part of her understood the impossible choice Samuel had faced, caught between protecting her from his enemies and destroying her life with his debts. The insurance investigators were closing in, and Jake warned her that Samuel would soon have no choice but to turn himself in or risk both of them facing charges for insurance fraud. That night, Martha sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the phone number Jake had given her, the number that would connect her to the husband she had buried but who had never really died. The weight of the decision before her felt crushing. She could call the authorities, expose the fraud, and ensure that Samuel faced justice for the pain he had caused. Or she could find a way to see him one last time, to understand the man who had loved her enough to fake his death but not enough to trust her with the truth. The phone rang before Martha could make her choice, and Jake's urgent voice on the other end changed everything once again. Samuel's creditors had finally tracked him down in Montana, and there had been a confrontation at the ranch where he was working. Samuel had been shot and was in critical condition at a hospital in Billings. If Martha wanted to see her husband alive, she needed to leave immediately, but doing so would mean abandoning any pretense that she hadn't known about the insurance fraud all along. Martha made her decision in that moment, choosing love over safety, truth over the comfortable lie she had been living. She threw clothes into a suitcase, arranged for a neighbor to watch Thunder and the other animals, and climbed into Jake's pickup truck for the desperate race to Montana. As the Texas landscape blurred past her window, Martha reflected on the strange turns her life had taken and wondered what she would say to the husband, who had been both dead and alive for the past 2 years. The hospital in Billings was a maze of sterile corridors and concerned faces, but Martha barely noticed her surroundings as Jake led her to Samuel's room. Nothing could have prepared her for the sight of her husband, pale and fragile in the hospital bed, connected to machines that monitored his fading life. The strong, weathered rancher she had married was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger who looked at her with a mixture of hope and terror when she entered the room. Their reunion was not the passionate reconciliation of romance novels, but rather the quiet, painful conversation of two people trying to rebuild a relationship from the ashes of betrayal. Samuel's voice was weak as he explained the threats that had driven him to such desperate measures, the sleepless nights he had spent worrying about Martha's safety, and the gradual realization that his cure had been worse than the disease. Martha listened without judgment, her anger tempered by the sight of her dying husband and the understanding that his choices, however misguided, had come from a place of love. The doctors gave Samuel days rather than weeks, and Martha faced the impossible task of grieving for a man who was dying for the second time in her life. But this time was different because this time she could be there, could hold his hand and tell him that while she couldn't forgive everything, she could forgive him. The insurance investigators would come eventually. There would be questions and legal consequences to face, but for now there was only the precious gift of time to say goodbye properly. Samuel's final request surprised Martha with its simplicity. He wanted to see Thunder one more time, to make peace with the animal that had been his partner in deception but also his link back to the life he had abandoned. The doctors said travel was impossible, but Martha and Jake found a way to bring a piece of home to the hospital, smuggling Thunder's halter and a handful of hay from the ranch into Samuel's room so he could smell the familiar sense of the life he had left behind. As Samuel slipped away in the early hours of a Montana morning, Martha held his hand and whispered forgiveness into the darkness. Jake stood silently in the corner, mourning the loss of a friend whose good intentions had led them all down such a difficult path. The cowboy who had started the story by riding Thunder would end it by helping Martha carry Samuel home to Texas, where he could finally rest in the cemetery plot she had purchased 2 years earlier. The funeral was small and private, attended only by Martha, Jake, and a handful of neighbors who never learned the full truth of Samuel's complicated death and resurrection. Thunder stood in the pasture beyond the cemetery, as if understanding that his role in the drama had come to an end. The insurance investigators eventually closed their case, satisfied that the money had been returned and that Samuel's actual death had resolved the fraud charges, though Martha suspected they never fully understood the tangled web of love, fear, and desperation that had created the situation. In the months that followed, Martha slowly rebuilt her life, this time with the knowledge that love sometimes required impossible choices and that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting. Jake Morrison became a permanent fixture on the ranch, no longer hiding his identity or his past, helping Martha work the land and care for the animals that had somehow survived all the human drama around them. Thunder grew gentler with age, as if the secret he had carried for so long had finally been released, allowing him to simply be a donkey again rather than a messenger bearing the weight of hidden truths. The widow's challenge that had brought Jake Morrison to Cedar Ridge became local legend, the story growing in the telling until few people remembered the real details of that day when a mysterious cowboy rode Thunder and changed everything. Martha never corrected the stories, understanding that sometimes the truth was too complicated for casual conversation, and that legends served their own purpose in a world where reality was often stranger than fiction. She had learned that bravery came in many forms, from riding an unbroken donkey to forgiving an unforgivable betrayal, and that sometimes the greatest courage was required not for grand gestures but for the quiet work of rebuilding a life from the pieces of broken dreams and second chances. The years that followed brought a quiet peace to the Whitfield ranch that Martha had never expected to find again. Jake Morrison proved to be more than just a capable ranch hand. He became the steady presence that helped her navigate the complex emotions of loving a man who had both saved and betrayed her. They never spoke of romance, but there was an understanding between them born of shared loss and the knowledge that some bonds are forged in crisis and tempered by time. Thunder lived out his remaining years in the pasture behind the house, no longer the wild, untamable beast that had challenged dozens of riders. Sometimes Martha would find Jake standing by the fence, watching the old donkey graze in the morning light, and she knew he was thinking about Samuel and the weight of secrets that had nearly destroyed them all. The crescent scar beneath Thunder's coat had faded with age, but the memory of what it represented remained fresh in both their minds. The insurance settlement had been quietly resolved, with Martha repaying the fraudulent claim and accepting a probationary period that kept her from facing criminal charges. The ranch struggled financially for a time, but Jake's knowledge of cattle and horses helped them diversify their operations, and slowly they built something sustainable from the ashes of Samuel's desperate gamble. The neighbors never knew the full story, but they respected Martha's resilience and Jake's quiet competence, accepting him as part of the Cedar Ridge community without too many questions about his past. On a particularly clear evening in late autumn, Martha found herself standing in the same barn where this story had begun, watching Jake repair a broken bridle with the patience of a man who had learned that some things couldn't be rushed. Thunder had passed peacefully the month before, and his absence left an emptiness that went beyond the loss of a single animal. He had been their connection to Samuel, to the complicated love story that had brought them together, and without him the ranch felt different, quieter somehow. "Do you ever regret it?" Martha asked Jake as he worked, her voice carrying the weight of all the unspoken questions that had accumulated over the years. Helping us." Jake paused in his mending, considering her words with the same careful attention he gave everything in his life. "I regret that we thought deception was the only way," he said finally. "But I don't regret protecting you, and I don't regret being here when you needed someone to help carry the truth." Martha nodded, understanding that some questions didn't have simple answers, that life was messier and more complicated than the stories people told about it. She had learned to live with ambiguity, to find peace in the spaces between right and wrong where real people made impossible choices and tried to live with the consequences. The challenge that had once drawn riders from 3 states was now just a memory, but Martha had discovered that the real test had never been about staying on Thunder's back for 8 seconds. It had been about staying upright when everything she thought she knew about her life had been thrown into question, about finding the strength to forgive when forgiveness seemed impossible, and about building something new from the wreckage of broken promises and hidden truths as the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Martha of better times and simpler dreams. She realized that some stories don't have clean endings. They have continuations, quiet moments where people choose to keep going despite the scars they carry, where love persists even when trust has been tested beyond its limits. The widow's challenge had ended, but Martha Whitfield's life continued, shaped by loss but not defined by it, carrying forward the hard-won wisdom that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply choose to stay in the saddle, no matter how wild the ride becomes. In the distance, a new foal kicked up dust in the pasture where Thunder had once roamed, and Martha smiled at the sight of fresh life taking root in familiar ground. Some stories end where they began, but this one would continue as long as there were people willing to face the morning with hope, to take on challenges that seemed impossible, and to believe that even the most broken things could sometimes be made whole again.